Is COVID-19 the new climate change? Whoa. Rita Panahi, James Morrow and myself, Rowan Dean, the outsider's guide to everything. So let's fire away. Rita Panahi, what do you reckon? Is COVID-19 the new climate change?
No, that's not what I believe. I'm sorry to if that disappoints you, but no, I don't think it is. I think COVID-19 is deadly to segments of the population. We know that. It may leave most people unscathed. We know the recovery rate is enormous for people who are healthy, who are under 60, but for older people, particularly those who've got pre-existing conditions, it can and does kill you. So let's not pretend that this is on par with some of the false predictions we've heard about climate change, or some of the hyperbole we've heard about, you know, people dying where the activists can't substantiate what they're saying. I think it serves as an example to climate activists about how they can change societies quickly and how they can motivate activity. So I think for a lot of climate activists, they are very interested in the response to COVID-19, and in fact some of them blame climate change for COVID-19. We would have we've talked about some commentary we've seen where they say coronavirus is Mother Nature's reaction to the human race. You know, we've heard that nuttiness, but I don't see them. I don't see the parallels there at all, because one can kill you once.
The UN Sustainable Business Chief, Lisa Kingo, does see clear parallels and claims that the coronavirus pandemic is just a fire drill for what is likely to follow from the climate crisis, James. So this idea that, oh, bad as this is, as Rita says, this is genuinely bad, but, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet, James.
Well, look, I think we could take Lisa Kingo in the United Nations and say that they're just a big fire drill. But let's put them to one side here. I want to get back to the main question here. And I'm going to disagree a little with what Rita had to say before. You know, okay, sure, we can absolutely say that coronavirus has an actual death toll attached to it, which climate change really, let's be frank, doesn't. And we do know that COVID-19 is deadly to some people who get the disease. Not denying that one bit. But what I think is absolutely fascinating, and how I think it is very similar to climate change, is how it has taken on a certain very pro-state intervention, almost totalitarian approach to it, has become an article of faith on the left. Just as with climate change, you know, the biggest, strongest, most economy-killing interventions, again, are the things that become articles of faith on the left. And we did see at the start of this whole thing, these models by IHME and all of these other groups that predicted we would have seen 150,000 Australians killed, many more millions dead that have already tragically died. And yet those predictions, just as with climate change, have been used to make policy across the world, including in Australia, that have resulted in economic disasters, huge loss of livelihoods, huge loss of business, huge loss of enterprise, potentially a whole lost generation to this thing. And in many ways, I think this is like climate change, not because it's, you know, a dry run for what happens when, climate change's effects come in, but rather, this is showing us what happens when too much of the economy is given over to planners with a very statist inclination based on dodgy modeling to control what we all do. That's how this is like climate change, at least to me.
Well, I would agree with that, and I would agree that both are based on an invisible enemy. Rita is correct that, of course, there is a genuine death toll from the coronavirus. But what is fascinating, James, you referred to the modelling. The fear and hysteria is driven in both instances by an invisible enemy, because the virus, it is the fear of the virus. We know who it affects and who it doesn't affect. We are increasingly knowing what drugs do and don't work. We are increasingly knowing what processes hand sanitizing, etc., are necessary. But the fear and alarmism keeps coming back to these model projections based on no reality of how disastrous everything could be if we don't do X, Y, and Z, and more importantly, if the citizenry don't buckle down and do precisely what they are told. And that is where the parallel is at its greatest, Rita, I would have thought. The
fear you speak about is really interesting, because there was some polling that came out just in the last week where the percentage of people who actually died compared to what many in the community thought had died was vastly different. And from the UK to the US, people have completely, maybe it's the saturation media coverage, maybe it's the fact that, in Australia we publicise every single death from this virus, but what people thought was the percentage of the population who had perished because of coronavirus and the reality were just so poles apart that you do fear about the information people are receiving and how scared they must be if they think 5-7% of the population has died from this pandemic.
James, this idea of the fire drill, I think, is actually terrifying because, as Rita says, you can look anywhere. You will click on Google, whatever. There's all the figures there of all the cases around the world. This number of cases here, there, graphs all busy popping up left and right and centre. You can't escape them. Actually try and find out who the people were or who actually died, how many died specifically of the disease, not comorbidities, not with the disease, but specifically of it. You'll struggle to find it. And the idea that there is this wealth of information about the invisible enemy, in other words, the contagion, the infection rate, when we know that the majority of people by far may be asymptomatic or won't even notice they've had it. So the fear is driven by this invisible enemy, and we're basing all our political actions on this invisible enemy rather than the hard data.